The how to get good series, and we're starting off with splat zones. Let's hit the ground rolling. Let's talk about how to get good in splat zones. Whether you're a solo player playing splat zones, by yourself, or you're on a team and you want to get better at splat zones for your team or even with your team, this is the video for it. The first thing we're going to talk about is honestly team comp and roles. The first thing you got to ask yourself is honestly, what is everyone's role / what is everyone's job? No one wants to play 5 minutes of zone with that one teammate that honestly doesn't know exactly what they're doing or even what they need to do. So let's talk about what you need to do to bring your energy to essentially help your team win the game so that you're able to essentially bring that 25% to the 100% of winning the game. Now, every role has a specific job that, it typically wants to do in the middle of a game, in the beginning of the game, and generally towards the end, but also with the objective. So let's start off with the 4 roles that generally are in the game that I want to talk about. And the first one is anchor, second is slayer, third is support, and fourth would be pressure / mid slayer. The first role we have is anchor, and typically anchor players, for example, are going to want to run things like explosher, things like charger, things like a heavy or a ballpoint, or even things like a rapid blaster. If you're running more of a fast with no real, I want to say quote unquote backline comp, rapid blaster is a good anchor weapon, or even jet sculpture. The job that an anchor player generally has is that you want to stay alive as long as possible, but as well as essentially hold a position on the map that your teams can both jump to you if they need to, get back into the fight, but also be able to just go back, retreat to you if they need help. Essentially, how many times has you seen a teammate, an enemy actually retreat back to their charger player and their charger player just snipes you and you're like, what? Where did that come from? It happens all the time, and just having an anchor player essentially helps your team have a little bit of ground and hold a position that they're able to hold as their own as an anchor player. Next up, we have the Slayer role. Slayer role is essentially weapons like the Nozzle Nose L3D, things like the T-Tech, things like Splash, Splash-O-Matic, things like Dualies, weapons like the Kenza 52. These are really good frontline Slayer weapons. Your job as a Slayer weapon is to essentially provide frontline pressure as well as help your team confirm splats that they couldn't on their own, or even couldn't in that moment. For example, if your team quickly weakens an opponent, you want to be able to quickly go in with your T-Tech and confirm that kill and just finish it off. That way your team is now in the advantage with a 4v3 instead of just having that person be alive, they go back, and now you're still in this 4v4 rumble. Something to also consider is that Slayer weapons can essentially still flank and be the designated flanker for your team. If your team ever needs a flank or a distraction on the side, having that player that can quickly go in and flank on the side is typically the role of a Slayer. Next up, we have weapons in the support class, which include things like NZAP, things like Junior, things like 10 Umbrella, or even regular Umbrella come in this category as well. The job of a support weapon is to essentially not only support your team in 1v1 scenarios and team fights, but also providing map coverage and just overall paint on the ground, so that way your team has places to retreat to if they need to. They have map control, as well as you're basically in this current metagame, you're able to get armor and provide armor for your team so that they don't just lose in those 1v1s because they don't have armor. So getting armor is super important as a support weapon if your team is running armor on support. When helping in 1v1s, a support weapon can also just essentially paint your teammates' feet, as sometimes in 1v1s your teammate's feet might not be covered because their weapon doesn't cover their feet, but you covering your teammates' feet helps them out, as your teammate's going to be able to quickly move better than your opponent who doesn't have their feet covered, and they're going to be a little bit messed up. And the fourth role that I like to mention is essentially the midline Slayer, which I also call the Pressure, which are weapons that essentially things like Bucket, Blaster, CDS if that's on your comp, K-Pro. The job of a Pressure / midline Slayer is to essentially provide frontline pressure on the enemy if your Slayer is on a flank. But if your Slayer is not on a flank, you can also offer an off-angle pressure, as essentially your weapons are fast killing weapons, but not too fast like an actual Slayer. So you can actually provide some pressure so that, let's say you're a slosher player, you get one slosh on your enemy, your teammates then able to quickly come in as a Slayer and finish off the splat like I mentioned earlier. And that's super important, as a Pressure is basically providing pressure, is putting pressure on your opponents, and also being a quote unquote midline Slayer. And so you're able to basically put frontline pressure so the enemy team can't just walk all over you or just press W on you, forward. When assembling your team comp, something that's super important to keep in mind is that in the team comp for zones, you typically want 3 weapons that can paint. 2 is okay, but 3 is a quote unquote is like that golden ratio that you want to hit, so that basically if one of your teammates is down, you're not struggling having one player have to paint and cover all themselves. 3 weapons are capable of painting, things like CDS, Splash, Junior. These are all weapons that can basically paint and cover, so that let's say Splash goes down because it's in 1v1, it's a Slayer, it goes down, you still have CDS and Junior that are still able to paint, and you're still able to keep map control. Now let's talk about rollouts, and this is typically what you want to do in the beginning of the map for your weapon / roll in the beginning of Splat zones. And this is generally like I want to say a general look over on rollouts. You typically want to go over rollouts with your team and just basically discuss what is your best plan for actually pushing zone and getting zone in the beginning 30 seconds of the match. Now let's take Wahoo World zones for an example, and on here essentially everyone typically rushes left and holds left side zone, and this is really well. While everyone does this, Anchor, Slayer weapons are going to be here, and support players are going to be here, but they're going to be a bit late. And what I mean by this is that a support player, like I said earlier, wants to essentially get map control, but also wants to get that armor in the beginning 30 seconds of the match to help their team. If the enemy has armor and your team doesn't, you are essentially going to lose that 1v1, as the enemy team is just going to press forward on you and just win more 1v1s on your team, as it's going to be easier for them with armor compared to your team who doesn't have armor yet. So in the first 30 seconds, I suggest support players go and build their armor as quickly as possible so that they're able to essentially pop armor to help their team. From here, like I said earlier, Slayers and Anchor players are going to be playing on the left side, and Anchor players essentially want to basically make a little pathway for them to essentially not only retreat, but also be able to move around in, recover their ink. And if it's, let's say, a charger player, you're essentially going to be able to get paint onto zone, as well as put pressure on your enemy, as you're not going to essentially allow your enemies to push up on you for free. As an Anchor player, you're essentially going to try and hold, you're going to establish ground that you're going to hold. And let's take this essential, I want to say this little dummy where it's at, and this side of zone, this side of the map, we're going to essentially hold this place as an Anchor player, as this is really important to do as an Anchor player, as you basically want to have this be the ground that if your team needs to retreat to, they can retreat to you, and they could use the space willingly, and you don't allow your enemies to essentially push you for free. Still continuing with the Wahoo World example, essentially Slayer players are going to want to essentially put paint on zone, as the first thing you want to do in the first 30 seconds is actually paint the map and actually paint zone, as getting the first tick on zone is actually really cool and really important, as you're essentially able to put timer and pressure your opponents into actually having to push up on you and paint zone. So getting that first initial paint on zone is really crucial. But as a Slayer player, essentially what you can also do is just essentially be the frontline pressure and scout whether or not your enemy is actually going to push you, things like that. And from here you can make a decision on whether or not you want to push up and take a one-on-one, use your pressure that's going to be on an off angle and basically put pressure on your enemies and essentially punish your opponents for either pushing you and things like that. And it's very complicated, and this is stuff that comes with time and more practice as you play the game, but also more experience with you come when you play as a team. So hey, continue playing with your teams and just try zones only scrims and try it out to get a better feel of how you want to approach and do those first 30 second engagement as a Slayer player, as a pressure, as a Anchor, and as a support. On Wahoo World, while I did say Anchor and Slayer were going to play on left and support was going to help out on the left as well, I did not mention pressure there, because pressured weapons essentially on Wahoo World zones, I believe, should take right side of zone. I think the pressure should honestly be on an off angle here on this map and essentially cover the map on the right side. That way now your team also has a different vantage point for which they can pressure your opponents on, and also essentially offer a different lane for if your team needs to retreat to, they can retreat to the left lane, to the right side of the zone. So pressure should obviously kind of try and hang out here, put some pressure on your opponents, as if your opponents overextended, they don't realize that you're there, you essentially offer a different angles of pressure, and let's say your enemies push up on you, you then come in as a pressure weapon and then basically weaken your enemies, so that then your Slayer weapon can quickly come in and finish the splat. And that's basically pinching your opponent because they overextended and essentially doing what your pressure is supposed to do. Now, building special is super important, and if you don't have a pick in the first couple seconds of the match, it could happen, something that's really important to do is actually build your specials so that you're essentially able to then push back, you're able to push the zone and essentially take that team fight. Things like popping armor, things like popping rain, popping bomb rush. These are all specials that help in essentially putting pressure on your opponents, as well as covering zone and putting the timer on you guys, so that way your opponents have to react to you guys. Now let's talk about after you basically won that team fight. What's your important thing to do is actually take position and honestly take map control. Your opponents are going to want to quickly come back into zone, regroup, and push you guys. So something that's really important to do, something that's really important in Splatoon 2, is to honestly paint and keep map control. Map control is what prevents your opponents from quickly pushing in on you guys, as well as allowing your enemies to essentially push you guys for free. Taking position that essentially denies position from your enemies, as well as keeping map control, makes it harder for your enemies to essentially push you. What I mean by this is that if most of the zone and most of the entire map is covered in your ink, it's harder for your opponents to push you, as they're not sure if you're quickly sharking there. They're not, it's going to be harder for them to push in, because any place that they're pushing in that is covered in your ink, they then have to spend time covering it up, painting, scouting, and that's time that they don't have, as the zone is ticking down in your favor. When it comes to positioning to hold, you basically want to hold a position that your team can essentially abuse and take advantage of, so that way your weapon can essentially take more 1v1s easier. Let's take, for example, like I said, on Wahoo World Zone, Charger, backline, anchor weapons are essentially going to probably hold zone or a little bit forward of zone, and essentially they make it harder for your enemies to essentially come in on you. Chargers can also hold anchor players can also hold a very large, I want to say open area, very lane that's quickly, like, I want to say very long, and that essentially is because anchor players have a very long shooting weapon, so they're able to essentially take advantage of that with their weapon. Slayer weapons might take a quick sharking position, so that if the enemies quickly rush in and paint without scouting you, you're able to quickly pop up and shoot them. Same thing with pressures and support weapons. They might basically be playing more midline and more of a left or right holding position, so that essentially they're able to either support their Slayer weapon or just keep map control and prevent the enemies from pushing back in. When you take control of a position, make sure to hold that position and essentially make space. You want to essentially be able to hold that area and control it, so that essentially you're denying your opponents from coming in there, and you're basically extending your, I want to say, your reach that your team can then come out to, and also pressure. For example, if your team is holding on, like I said, this side of Wahoo World, it's harder for your opponents to get back in and hold that, especially if that space is, you take it and you take it for free. No one's defending it. Your enemy's not, pressuring you or like pushing you out of that position. Take space and you make space, and you do this by painting and holding a position. If an enemy tries to fight you while you're in the position, you try your best to win that 1v1, as it's super important that you hold that, as if your opponents try to push you out of that position and you're quickly able to take one or two of them down, but let's say you trade in the process, now instead of it being just a 4v4 or a 3v4 and you lose, your team is actually losing in that position, now essentially your team is in a 3v2 and your team is actually taking advantage. And the best part is that position is probably still weak, as the enemy's not going to want to essentially quickly cover that area, that position that was exposed. They have to quickly still provide pressure in the front, as your team is constantly pushing back in. If you're the team that actually lost the 4v4 and just the whole team fight overall, something that's really important to do now is honestly paint your base, as your enemies are probably going to try to either push up on you, hold position against you, and not deny you space from actually pushing back in. So something you're going to want to do is actually paint, make sure that there's not an enemy nearby sharking, but also check for your surrounding areas. But also something that's really important to do is build your specials. Specials are so important in Splatoon for allowing you to push back in, because if you're able to paint and then basically pop specials to then reinitiate that fight and re-push in, you're essentially able to, let's say with a bomb rush, take zone from your enemies, and this actually now flips it, and now the pressure is on your enemies and not on you for having to push back in. And popping specials like armor helps your team for when they go back into a fight. They're essentially able to then win their 1v1s better. Inkjet allows you to essentially put pressure on your opponents. All these sort of things are done because specials are really good for pushing back in. So if your team lost the fight and need to push back in, paint, build your special, and take control of position. Something that's also important to note is to honestly group up and push in with your team. No one wants to push in solo. No one wants their teammates to push in by themselves. So it's really important for you to be aware of where your teammates are and push in with them and support them, so that essentially you're able to take 2-on-1s and not just 1-on-1s, and you're in the losing favor. Now I want to take an example of Arena Cup and essentially use this as an example of what to do and how to do it. Here we see the yellow team essentially has a very nice easy comp. We have H3D as the support weapon, we have Splash as the aggro weapon, we have Rapid Blaster as the anchor, and we have CDS as the pressure slash as the off mid lane slayer, I should say. Then on the blue team, we essentially have their dually squelchies essentially as their front line, their NZAP as their support, their E leader as their anchor, and they have their bucket as their pressure slash midline slayer, like I said. And you see in the beginning that quickly every team is pushing out. CDS is holding the right side of position, and essentially being here on the right side allows CDS to put pressure on the entire team that's going to be here. And H3 is a little bit back because H3 is building special, because H3 understands that the most important thing for the team fight is having armor. Splash, Splash-O-Matic, and Rapid both take this position, as Anchor wants to essentially hold this position and basically make it so that the Splash needs to retreat. They can, but if the Splash wants to push up, the Anchor is there essentially supporting the Splash-O-Matic in a 2v1. So let's see. And on the blue team, we see something similar where NZAP is building armor, CDS is holding the position again, but here we see that E leader is actually holding zone and putting pressure on the zone by themselves. Bucket, as we see here, is quickly going to be actually going underneath, and this creates an issue where Bucket doesn't really do much down here. And I believe that the mistake for this team is essentially pushing down here, and I think Bucket in hindsight should have been up here with this E leader, because let's say as we see soon enough, NZAP's able to actually build armor, but E leader gets pressured out. He's not able to do much, and as we see right there in a few seconds, sorry, that went by really quickly. As we see there really quickly, CDS quickly just comes in, spots the actual buckets here, puts pressure here, and that just denies space. They just denied space from the bucket, and the bucket couldn't do anything. The bucket essentially is, for the most part, useless here. As what are they going to do? They can't win their 1v1 against the CDS on high ground. If they retreat, they're just wasting time, and the CDS might possibly chase them. The NZAP is here, and he's not supporting the E leader, so the E leader is by himself. And while the dually switchers are here taking an off angle, it's like they're taking an off angle, but with who? The E leader? That's about it. They're able to do their job, but not as effective as they would be if the slosher was here. So as we see right here, CDS quickly goes in and quickly splats slosher really quickly, and that just confirms a splat because of slosher's poor positioning. Slosher's actually in a really bad spot and can't do much. So CDS quickly gets a splat. They're able to quickly do something, as they might pop armor, but their armor is essentially pointless because they have no frontline pressure. Like, armor's only useful if you have frontline pressure. And how does yellow squad retaliate and in response to that? They pop their own armor. They're in position. They essentially are gonna soon, I believe, CDS is gonna quickly go in, get a splat here, and from there just goes, okay, cool, we have pressure on zone because no one else is contesting us. Their dually switches can't contest zone by himself. E leader tries to get a pick but gets denied by the wall. But also E leader can't do much here, as again there's no frontline pressure for the E leader to take an off angle or anything like that. NZAP is here. They shout out that the slosher lost, so now what do? They all drop down to essentially fight this one player that just put pressure, as their name implies that they do. And now look at this, they have armor. See, they essentially took zone for free because the blue team gave up zone. They quickly push out. CDS comes in, takes down the NZAP. Now dually switch is back here by himself, can't do anything. E leader is here by himself, can't do anything as well. E leader gets chased down, died, and CDS just is here and can't do much. They're just gonna get quickly surrounded and just eventually taken down. After they do take down the yellow team CDS, but at what cost? You got one pick, but the enemy team got 2-3 picks on your entire team and was able to just get zone for free, so it didn't matter. Now look at this, because they're able to essentially take it, they now take map control. This is a really good example of just once you have zone, take map control, take position, deny your enemies free space. Just by covering this, it makes it harder for the blue team to come in here, take this space. Having splash on this side now makes it harder for like what I believe that's the dually scorches on this side of the map to actually come back in, and actually it's harder for them because they're not able to essentially deny any space here. And that's so huge just by painting the map and taking that first initial fight. They're able to pop specials, but they popped one special. They're not combining their specials to quickly push in together. So if you're ever going to push in, pop specials together. And this is just a really good example of what I mean by like take control, take position. And now look at this. Bucket's on the right. He tried to push in, but they're not able to do it alone. They might have armor, but 2-on-1. They quickly just call him out, take him out, and boom. And they quickly just continue painting zone and just keeping pressure. As we see here, they might get one pick. I think the clock is still ticking, but again, they're able to just constantly paint. And like, I don't know if I mentioned this before, but while zone is constantly ticking, something that's really important to do is constantly paint zone. If zone is under attack, if there's a booyah bomb thrown at zone, paint zone. Sometimes all you need to do is not get that quick splat, but instead just quickly paint zone so that the timer continues ticking. The timer ticking is more important than you getting that one splat. And we see here that, like, blue team's able to get a quick pick or two, but essentially, yellow team's still able to hold position. They're still able to hold control. And like Anchor is still holding zone, holding objective, and just providing pressure that they're able to essentially paint. You have one player on the right painting, but they can't do it alone. Bucket's underneath, again, for some reason, trying to do something, but they can't. CDS might be here and they might, put pressure, but they can't. The zone is still ticking. Bucket's under the clock. They quickly, call it the CDS. They're able to take the pick of the CDS. E leaders in the back trying to get a pick, not able to do much. This, I believe, this the NZAP. The NZAP is here. They're able to paint, but like they can't outpaint four other people painting. Bucket is here, but he gets called out because, again, by themselves, not in correct positioning. It's just a free, easy, fight. The team doesn't even try to like win against the NZAP. They know that all they need to do is just paint. They get the pick here, but like this player right here is more focused on just painting because they know that in order to win, all they need to do is get the tick. And yeah, this is a really good example of how to actually take zone, how to actually win. And just look at this. Look at the map coverage. The blue team was able to basically paint, but they weren't able to essentially hold the position and push out from there and take a fight that they actually wanted to, and it's fight in unison. Yellow team did that the entire time. They held control. You barely see blue team here because blue team never got control of zone. That entire set and many more matches are on splatzones.jp. The link will be in the description. Shout outs to those guys for just having great content and just great footage. And if you want to improve in zones, not just play in zones and rehearse for your team, but also watch what other players are doing. Watch how other teams, their comps, and how they establish and play zones. As sometimes watching helps you more than just simply playing. Sometimes all you need to do is get an outsider or a bird's eye perspective to truly understand the situation. So yeah, shout out to these guys. Again, link in the description. Check them out. Check those guys out. If anything I mentioned in today's video sounds a little bit confusing, I stream on Twitch. Gabe Rainery, link in the description down below. Come hang out. Come ask me any questions you might have about today's video, or just anything you want to know about how to play zones better or anything like that. If you want to not miss another Splatoon 2 tips or tricks, another video on this amazing series of how to get good, make sure to like, comment, subscribe. It helps me out, it helps the channel, it helps me in the algorithm. So yeah, you guys say this channel is underrated. I want to believe you guys. So hey, leave a like, leave a comment, help your boy out. Remember guys, you got this. I believe in you. Believe in the me that believes in the you, and you can do this. You can win your zone matches. Good luck in them. I'm out. Later.